Welcome to my pharmacy. I'm a health economist. I love pharmacy. I've been studying pharmacy for 20 years. What I want to do today is just go through some thoughts about pharmacy, and I think it will be up to you to make a decision about what you think of them. I'm sitting in a pharmacy that's about 120 years old, with the original pharmacy bottles and carboys and all of the materials. So we'll see what conclusion we draw. So welcome, and we have about 45 minutes, so we'll just take it easy. And as I change the slides, please change the slides along with me. So welcome. The talk today is "The Pharmacy is Dead. Long live the pharmacist." Now, what does this mean? Well, basically it means this. I love pharmacy, but I think the pharmacy premises, the outlet, is very different to the pharmacist. And what I sense now, particularly with Amazon's latest announcement, is do we need to do more to understand the role of the pharmacist versus the role of the pharmacy? And what I want to do is just take you through a presentation that asks the question, is the pharmacy dead, but the pharmacist will survive the change? So where do we start? What I'd like to do is start by saying, if you're online, please tweet. If you'd like to talk to me afterwards, please send me an email. We also have comments, but I'm happy to answer questions at the end or points of clarification during the presentation. So where do we start? I think we start here. What I'm going to say to you is I'm going to make a number of points, okay? If you agree with the points, please carry on watching. I'm going to make 21 points. They're factual points, but if you disagree, you can always leave. If you're not happy with what I'm saying, you can leave, but I want to try and create common ground. And the reason that I want to try and create common ground is I think there's lots of confusion about what is happening in pharmacy. There's so many different things happening. I want to go back to first principles and say what actually is going on. Have pharmacists got a problem? And I'm going to do this from an economist perspective. And it's the economics of evolution, to look at the evolutionary process, because it is very clear, and this is my view, that pharmacists are world-class professionals. Pharmacists are equal to any other medical profession, and they can make such a significant contribution to patient welfare. Even in the time of COVID, they have kept working on the front line. So there's no doubt in my mind that as a clinician, a pharmacist is a very competent, world-class clinician. But from an economist point of view, which isn't a clinical point of view, I'm not sure whether anybody fully understands the economics of pharmacy. And the economics of pharmacy is very different to the finance of pharmacy. You can pay for something. You could buy a Ferrari and pay for it, but the economics of running a Ferrari is different to the finance. And what I want to do today is try and get to the economics of pharmacy. And the conclusion I'd like to draw is, do pharmacists need a pharmacy any longer? Or are pharmacists going to be a clinician? And I think this is what Amazon has done. It's raised the question, is the pharmacy dead? So let's see, we'll go to the first slide. I think we need to start somewhere quite simple, okay? Let's see. Pharmacy is an umbrella term, and the term pharmacy doesn't really have a use until modern time. It is a derivative term. At different times, pharmacy professionals had different names. But let's start with the simple thing that if you are a pharmacist, what you are originally involved in as an evolutionary chain was the compounding of medicines. And if you disagree with that point, then you can disappear. But I think pharmacists are people that take different ingredients and mix them together. That to me is a pharmacist. The key question is is, does that role still survive today? And as we go through, the reason I'm asking these questions is because the question is, do the roles that I am going to mention, the 21 things, are they still relevant today? It is very clear, without the beginning, with the mortar and pestle and the mixture of herbs, we wouldn't have a pharmacy profession today as we currently know it. So step one, if you agree, pharmacists started with medicines compounding. Step two, and this is a very interesting step. Very early on, there was the professionalization of pharmacy. Anybody could make medicines. There was hedge witches made medicines, priests made medicines, but the difference in pharmacy is very early on, the pharmacist became an identifiable profession because the guilds recommended that the grocers supplied medicines, but the apothecaries said, no, we are the people that supply medicines. And apothecaries got into conflict with the grocers and emerged as probably the first version of professionalized pharmacy. So not only are you medicines makers, because lots of people can make medicines, you are actually a profession. So medicine makers became a profession when apothecaries began. So the question is, does the profession of pharmacy survive into the future? Because if you can see from the slide, the profession of pharmacy was very important in the past. The key question is, do we need pharmacists today? Which leads us to our next slide. And this is the most important part of the whole talk. The word apothecary means storehouse. And when you go to pharmacies like the pharmacy I'm sitting in here and look at the drug runs and look at the carboys and look at the bottles, the idea was that pharmacists were the storehouse of medicines locally. Grocers would stock a gross, which was big. Pharmacists would stock small to make and compound medicines. So the question we need to bear in mind is, do we need pharmacies as storehouses? Can medicines be stored and made somewhere else, or do we still need the storehouse, the apothecary? So let's move on. Medicines exist, apothecaries made them, apothecaries professionalized them, and the apothecary as a shop was where they were stored. But you can see that we're now using the same name for the professional person and the shop. We have a pharmacist in a pharmacy, but they're two completely different things. And the conclusion that we hopefully draw today is that there is a different path for the pharmacist than the pharmacy. And we need to explore why that's the case. So the next thing, apothecaries became retail premises. They didn't just stay as storehouses. Apothecaries became a place where you could go to buy medicines. So it was somewhere where the public could go in, different to general practice. A doctor, you had to have an appointment. Pharmacists are retail shops. So in order for a pharmacy to survive, we need people going through the door. If people don't go through the door, you don't have a pharmacy. So you store medicines and you have the public there. If the public aren't there, have you actually got a pharmacy? I think importantly, and this is one of the reasons that apothecaries didn't disappear, is because many people could make medicines. And early on, a load of rubbish was supplied to the public. The pharmacist, in their earliest guise as the apothecary, had to win the trust of the public. And again, this is your key role, trust. Pharmacy is based upon relationships. Do online suppliers have the same relationships? A simple example, if you supply medicine 200 years ago to a local family and it kills them, the local community can come and find you. Medicines merchants, other people that were making medicines didn't have that thing. A pharmacist has to be conservative because a pharmacist is locally based. Importantly, the sign of the apothecary was the mortar and pestle. The key question to ask yourself today is, are you a compounder of medicines? Do you still believe in the mortar and pestle? Are you still guided by that in your work? If not, What are you? Have you left the mortar and pestle behind? Are modern clinical pharmacists no longer identifying with mixing medicines? Because if so, everything that we've had so far, the storehouse, the retail, is not important to your future. What are you? Without the mortar and pestle, you're no longer an apothecary. Without the mortar and pestle, what are you? So moving forward, the early stages, the medieval stages, were mortar and pestle, storage, taking small quantities of medicines, herbs, mixing them. But then came the chemical revolution. And during the 19th century, 1800s, pharmacists became chemists and druggists. And this was a massive change in the profession of pharmacy. Eventually, the apothecaries merged with the chemists and druggists, but chemists and druggists were revolutionaries. And the shop we have here is a reflection below of the apothecary role with the drawers and the herbs, and above the chemist and druggist role with the bottle. So the question for you is, are you a chemist and druggist? Are you somebody that believes in science? Are you somebody that understands how medicines are made? Are you somebody that makes medicines, or are you somebody that understands the chemical constitution of medicines? And I think later in the training of pharmacists in recent years, the emphasis has moved away from making medicines to understanding the chemical and biological underpinnings of the medicines that you use. Again, what I'm trying to do is unravel the future of pharmacy. But what we have here is a pharmacist, a chemist and druggist, having to learn the knowledge themselves. Whereas previously in an apothecary, you could have storage of herbs. Somebody else could come in there and pick the herbs. Now we've got the idea of a chemist and druggist with the knowledge in their mind. And that without that person there, the medicine can't be made because it's knowledge. And then pharmacists started having their own recipe books. So the next stage was that not only the professionalization of medicine, it was the idea of knowledge management. And quite early on, pharmacists became knowledge managers because they had to understand chemistry. Where do we go next? Because of the revolution in retailing, what we found is that the chemist and druggist, unlike the apothecary, moved into Victorian shops which had glass-fronted windows, glass bottles, glass implements. It became this amazing Aladdin's cave of light, gaslight and glass, and magical. And people would go in to see the chemist and druggist with their bottles, their colored liquids, create something amazing. And in probably a lot of the instances, there was a placebo effect, the idea that you were going into somewhere magical. 50, 100, 200 years earlier, you had an apothecary shop full of crocodiles and turtles and dead animals and herbs. And now you had the introduction of modern science. When people walk into your pharmacy shop today, are they walking into a herbalist, or are they walking into a scientist's den? Is it science or nature? What is pharmacy? The important thing to realize is that the chemists and druggists were different to the apothecaries. The apothecaries had mortar and pestles. The chemist and druggist, their sign was a carboy. And the carboy was the sign of a pharmacist. And there was real pride. If you read the book Through a Chemist's Window, it says a real chemist will only display carboys. They will not display medicines in their window. So the carboy became the sign of the chemist. And the carboy is what you are. If you look here, I have a carboy. Pharmacists are carboys. They're mortar and pestles or carboys. Which one are you? The person with the knowledge and the carboy, or the person with the understanding of nature and the body and mixing things together? The two are separate strands in your profession, but they're called the same thing now, but they still exist. So where do we go? Unfortunately, for a while, with the growth in retail, lots of people started making medicines commercially. So the pharmacist was not the only person making the drugs. They were made by manufacturers. And those manufacturers made quite a lot of rubbish. Or if it wasn't rubbish, it didn't do what it said on the box. So as a result, what happened is most drugs didn't work or were dangerous. They might contain glass instead of the ingredients. They might not have in mummia as they promised, but there was a lot of medicines. And if you read the Chemist and Druggist magazine, you will find advert after advert for things that were just had to be discarded. So pharmacists moved from being herbalists to chemists to people with shops with cardboard boxes full of things of unknown benefit. That couldn't continue because of two things. Firstly, they were selling dangerous things. And secondly, it's easier to have a big factory to make cardboard boxes full of medicines than a small pharmacy making the same. Because of the problems, in about 1860 in the UK, the government had to intervene and say enough is enough. Pharmacists now need to protect the public from medicines rather than supply. So pharmacists moved from a production point of view into a safeguarding role. And at the time, medicines were referred to as poisons. And I think today we should still call medicines poisons, because most medicines have the doctrine of double effect. They're going to do good and bad. We can see this around the world. You can see this even with normally prescribed medicines. There's so much damage being done. So medicines were poisons. The pharmacists made herbs. They made chemicals. And then the manufacturing started, and the public were inundated with things that did them lots of damage. And the chemist and druggist became the person who can control the access to medicines. So what are you? Are you a storehouse? Are you a professional with knowledge? Or are you a police? Are you the police, the medicines police? Which one are you? Where it's kept, where it's made, or the policing role? This is important to the question of whether the pharmacy or the pharmacist survive. Next, pharmacists became path-dependent dispensers. Up until 1900, pharmacists did not dispense drugs. 3% of a pharmacy business was dispensing. A prescription from a doctor given to a pharmacist represented less than 5% of the work that they did. 1900, dispensing business didn't exist. Not until after the Second World War, with the introduction of the pharmaceutical industry, did dispensing exist as a business opportunity for pharmacists. In the NHS in England in 1948, 60% of medicines were dispensed by doctors before the introduction of the NHS. The majority of dispensing was done by doctors, not pharmacists. And this is a sign here that you will see on this slide that a pharmacist would have in their shop, saying this is the dispensing, not the counter sales, the dispensing sales. And I'm lucky enough to have this sign in my collection of pharmacy antiques. So what happened next? You've got pharmacists that compound, pharmacists that can create medicines with chemically, and you've got pharmacists safeguarding, and you've got pharmacists dispensing doctors' prescriptions. What happened next is the pharmaceutical industry killed the compounding pharmacist. It killed the manufacturing. It made a pharmacist a shopkeeper that dispensed rather than somebody that made drugs. So therefore, in England, for example, with the introduction of the NHS, the pharmacist became the dispenser. And that's where we are today. We've got dispensing and pharmacist. And this is our problem. Historically, we have a dispensary and we have a pharmacist. The pharmacist is highly knowledgeable. The dispensary is just a historical accident. Pharmacists do not need to be dispensers. It could be done in lots of other ways. It's a historical accident. So what happened then? In the 1980s, by the 1980s, pharmacy was seen as a dying profession. Pharmacy was seen as a lack of use of their degree, as something that was quite boring, and it was the supply of dispensed drugs. Do remember during the 80s, there were very few exciting new drugs around. A lot of drugs that were being used are not used today. So pharmacy in the 1980s was a dying profession. And then in 1990, along came pharmaceutical care. And a pharmaceutical care became the elixir of life for the pharmacy profession. It saved the profession because it tapped into professionalization and the chemist and druggist desire for knowledge. But because of pharmaceutical care, dispensing became embarrassing. And if dispensing became embarrassing, the pharmacy shop was no longer required. So from 1990s onwards, the pharmacist was seen as key and the shop was seen as old-fashioned, that didn't create medicines, that didn't need to store medicines, and it was only there because of a historical accident. The future lay, now this is 1990, the future lay with clinical skills. So is the pharmacy dead and the pharmacist alive? Well, the answer is this. The paper on pharmaceutical care was written before the internet was launched. It was written before mobile phones. It was written before all of the modern technologies we use today. And my belief is that if the paper on pharmaceutical care had been written today, it would have been written differently. And we need to throw the paper on pharmaceutical care in the bin and start again with a new paradigm for pharmacy practice. Because in 1990, there were two options: dispense or become doctors, dispense or copy nurses. But now there's a third option: dispense, become clinical, or become technologists. And if you look at the history of pharmacy, pharmacists were never dispensers. Pharmacists were technologists. They were technologists. They were compounders. They were creators. They were chemists. They were apothecaries. They stored the technology. Pharmaceutical care is a strategy that came too early in the life cycle of technology. Dispensing will disappear in local pharmacies. Pharmaceutical care has yet, after 30 years, to establish itself as a viable alternative, and the halfway house between the two is the technologist. So, two more. If you haven't left yet, there's two more. Pharmacy premises are being ignored. Read your journals and see how many papers look at what can be done with pharmacy premises compared with what can be done with pharmacists. Ask your professional bodies, what are you doing for pharmacy premises rather than pharmacists? We're looking at workforce now, but workforce requires the pharmacy. Given the current technologies, given 5G, given AI, given the need for access during COVID, wouldn't the premises be the most important thing, and the history of technology within pharmacy rather than knowledge? So pharmacies are being ignored. If you want to face the challenge of Amazon, online dispensing, if you fight your dispensing corner, you're going to lose because you've only been dispensers for 60 or 70 years. But if you fight the technology corner, then you're likely to win the battle. The key question, therefore, is will pharmacists become technologists, or will new technologies bypass the pharmacy? At the moment, I don't see enough work on turning the pharmacy into a technology hub. That, I think, is the blind side of the profession. Dispensing will go. It's too expensive to do locally. Pharmaceutical care will not be established until I start reading papers that say we've compared the pharmacist with the nurse. We've compared the pharmacist with the doctor. We see paper after paper with no comparator in. The future is technology. So let me draw some conclusions. Did you agree with all 21 points? If we have agreed, I'm going to say that the future for a pharmacist as a skilled professional is pharmaceutical care. And the local pharmacy is no longer needed. The pharmacy is dead. Long live the pharmacist. That's the conclusion. I can't see any alternative. I can't see a blueprint for a pharmacy. In the UK, something like 10% of pharmacies are rated excellent. Why aren't 100% of pharmacies rated excellent? Because we lack the technology. Are you convinced? Are you sure? Well, let me put something to you. The biggest challenge facing pharmacists today is COVID. Why is the biggest challenge facing pharmacists today COVID? Well, the answer to that is very simple: because of footfall. People will no longer go to their GPs for appointments. Their appointments will be online. Therefore, they won't nip into the pharmacist on the way back from the doctors. All of the location of pharmacies next door to a doctor's is going to diminish because people will have their consultations online and will not travel to the pharmacist because they won't need to travel to the doctors. And that is the biggest challenge of COVID. You're on the front line, but the problem is the front line has moved from the shop next door, the surgery next door, to online. And that's why online pharmacies will challenge. So let's just draw conclusions. What conclusions can we draw? I think unless you're careful, the pharmacy premises is dead because it no longer needs to be a storehouse. It no longer needs to be a retail premises. The drug industry make the medicines, the wholesalers store the medicines, and online provides the retail. The pharmacy's dead. I can't see anybody trying to save it. Long live the pharmacist. If clinical skills are the future, pharmacy profession is saved. But my honest opinion is without your pharmacy, you can't be pharmacists. Thank you very much.